So today's question to start off with, I thought would be interesting. What is the last book that you read and really enjoyed? Doesn't have to be work related, anything. Fabian, would you want to kick off?
Okay, I'll kick off. Yes, I can link it. So I am currently reading the Mistborn trilogy, The Final Empire, which is a fantasy thing, and it's really good. So I started, like a friend of mine, I like reading science fiction a lot, and when I don't read science fiction, I often read fantasy and other things. But a friend of mine recommended it, and it is absolutely spectacular. It has a really cool magic system, which has to do with metals, but I'm not going to go into detail. But it's just really like enjoyable to read, and I started before going on vacation, and then now I'm in book 3, and they're like chunky books, like 800 pages, and I'm just like, so it's great. Let me link it, because I think you should read it if you like fantasy.
Well, then I'll follow on next, because I also really enjoy fantasy. And while the current book that I'm reading is actually about the birth of Pixar, it doesn't have enough dragons in it for me to properly enjoy the book. Because the last set of books that I really enjoyed was an extension of the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb, but it's all these books that are set in the world that she creates. And what I really enjoyed the most about the books is that if you've read all of them, she leaves little Easter eggs in all of the books for people who've read the rest of the trilogy, of the series. So if you've read them all, you'll pick up on these little things that come along the way, and it gives you that warm, fuzzy feeling of, of having seen it all, of seeing all these things that she's talking about. So that was my favorite, but I think the last one I read was probably about 9 to 12 months ago, so I need a new one. So I'll go and have a look at Final Empire next. What about you, Gabriel?
I'm trying to remember the book that I'm reading right now, because it's on Kindle, so I don't always see the cover. But I think it's The History of Everything or something like that. It's a small collection of it goes telling you the history about geology, and it's a compilation of a lot of historical things, more or less related to science. It has been like a great reading, and also really enjoyed the Hitchhiking Guides to the Galaxy, the whole
fun
series. It's actually I read them in Portuguese, but I'm eager to get them in English again. But the Portuguese translation is so good that I think I don't want to get perhaps a different feeling with the English version. It's the original, but the puns in Portuguese are so well made as well. So
I think it's the same in the English version. I almost feel like they've tried very hard to make it work in your first language. And for someone sometimes when you're using your second language, you don't quite get all of the puns and the play on words. And I think if I read it in my second language, I definitely miss out on a whole bunch of stuff. Yeah.
No, I like the Hitchhiker's Guide Through the Galaxy. I think it's highly entertaining. And I think the translations are, I don't know, it's the same in German. I think the English is obviously fantastic, but when I didn't speak that much English, the German translation was really, really good. And so that was really nice.
What about you, Ash?
I don't have anything, sorry. I can't even remember the last book I read. And so it must have been very good, or it was either a long time ago. So, can't really remember, sorry. So unfortunately don't have anything to offer.
That's okay. Well, there's only a couple of things on the agenda, but feel free to add as if you think of anything. I seem to have most of them, but I'll get started, and if anyone has anything to add, please add them. The first thing, it's just an advert that the infrastructure team is looking for seed engineers for the performance team that's being created, and the usual disclaimer that goes, I really enjoy working with everyone, but it's just about making sure that people are aware of the opportunities that exist outside of Geo. And then I wanted to just give a quick update on the things that are happening around. So I mentioned at the beginning of August that I was keen to do a round of informal 360 review feedback. So I'm busy working with Jessica to get a culture amp survey set up for that. I realized I could do this with Google Docs, but I thought let's try and do this with culture amp and do this the right way. So we'll see how we go. And if I get frustrated enough, I'll just go back to Google Docs. And so that should come out in the next week or two when I get through that. Then Fabian and I are working on planning for the team and the department for next year. So Fabian's working on setting up what the product goals are that we would like to achieve by the end of the year. And then I'll work with him to figure out how we'll actually get that done and what the proposal needs to look like in terms of, do we need more people? Do we need a different team? Like how will this be structured? So it's very early days still, but we're hoping to get something together by the end of September, and we will share that. And in other news, we're putting out an offer to a front-end engineer to join Geo. So also I've said that unlike other teams, he'll actually be reporting into me so that we will be a cross-functional team rather than have him reporting separately. I'm pretty sure that that's going to be fine. There's one other team that's doing that model, and I don't see there being any problems with that. And the offer will go out this week, so we should hear back next week if it's been successful. And last thing is that there is an open retrospective item around the change to the new process, and I'm looking forward to hear back any feedback that anyone has around the change that we've made now that we've been running it for 2 months.
I have a question about the front-end engineer. Yeah. I think we used to have Kushal helping Geo. Is there any reason why we can still have him?
Well, we can still have him, but because his time is split between us and other teams, it can be difficult to try and coordinate when it's our turn and when it's their turn. And so just to try and give people a bit more focus, a lot of that sharedness is starting to change, where people, instead of being shared across multiple teams, are being focused to specific teams. So Kushal will now be able to focus on his other team, and we'll be able to get someone to focus on our team.
I also have something else to ask for the front-end engineer. I know this is super rare or maybe weird to ask, but we should have someone that may also be able to improve our CLI-based front-end code. So someone that may be able to make like the things that run in the terminal also beautiful in a way, because we have a lot of things that runs on terminals, and no one really cares about it. I think this is a focus that GitLab hasn't put any effort on it. Like only us, the developers, try to design something for the terminal, but no one is really taking time to...
So when you say design for the terminal, you mean making sure that the messages that get reflected back to the users are interesting and useful, and that it's done in a stylish way. That's formatting the text properly.
Yeah, not only that. If you use a few terminal tools, like for example Yarn, they have like this nice progress bar, and they do some kind of terminal animation. Other tools also pay some attention to how like the use of colors, or maybe using some text symbols, or do some ASCII art, or this kind of stuff, like to improve the tool.
Okay, I understand what you mean. I think that's probably, I can see that that's actually quite a different skill set from a front-end engineer. And I think that someone who's got experience in the front-end technologies might not actually know how to even go about making those changes in the terminal world. But I take your point that that's something that would actually be quite nice to have in GitLab, because a lot of it is actually done through the terminal. And yeah, I agree with Ashley. It sounds like we're talking more about UX. And I think the first thing we'd need to do is figure out from a UX perspective, what do we actually mean by making it nicer? And with all of the different personas that use the terminal, I mean, there's developers, there's systems administrators, there's the users of they're the administrators of GitLab.com, and then they're the administrators of the self-managed. And I think we need to figure out exactly what nicer means, and then figure out the skill set that would be needed to actually do that work.
So I think there's also a little bit of additional good news, though, because we are getting a product designer in November, and that person has at least, she does not have a ton of experience with command line UX, but I spoke in the interview about the need for us to take a look at our sort of user experience when it comes to the terminal. And I personally think that's actually really important, because in some scenarios, we may just not have a user interface available. And so I see your point, but I also think that we need to think quite carefully on what we actually try to achieve and what is important. But it may be really important in, for example, disaster recovery scenarios, right, where you can't access the graphical user interface anymore potentially, right, and then figuring out what are people actually looking for when they are interacting with the command line in that scenario. Or during installation, right, where there are tons of terminal commands, right? I know that, for example, Ash has posted, I think, some sort of runbook style applications, right? I think there's a lot of interesting opportunities, but I also think we don't fully, or at least I don't fully understand what the user need is at the moment and what their expectations are, right? And but I do think it's an important part of Geo, because people, their first contact with the product is probably through the command line, right? And there's a lot of Geo check, Geo status, Geo health, all of those things. I think there's plenty of opportunity to improve that.
And I also think that's something we should work on with the distribution team as well, because they own far more of the terminal, the life cycle that happens in terminal than us, and working with them together is probably a good idea.
Perhaps I just need to rephrase something. It's not just to be beautiful, but also to be consistent. It has to be similar experience between everything.
Yeah, and making sure that for every command that's there, that what is output is in, even just having it in the same tense or the same tone of voice, or the same padding from the left, all those little things all add up. Yeah. Well, there's nothing else that I had added to the agenda. Is there anything else on people's minds, or we can have a coffee chat for the rest of the time?
I have a 2-minute thing that I thought of yesterday evening, before, after I shut down my laptop and I didn't feel like putting it on again. Rachel and I talked about this. I'll just put it on the list. Epic structure. And so essentially, this is something that Rachel and I quickly touched on. And now that I've been here for a little while, I had more time to sort of look at the issues, right? And I've started creating a roadmap and all of those things using epics. But I think what I'm going to do in the future, and that's also a call for feedback, is I think at the moment we have some pretty chunky, large epics that I think, frankly, thought would be smaller when I wrote them. But the more I interact with them, the more I realize how big they are. So simplification of the upgrade process, for example, or verification of data. And when we started off, we had relatively big issues, right, that had a hefty weight of, let's say, 10. And then we grouped them into epics, and all of a sudden we had a really big epic with issues that are by itself also really large, right? And I think what we've started to do is saying, okay, we convert these really chunky issues into their own sub-epics that belong to a larger epic, and this sub-epic then gets broken down into really small pieces. And I think that's a pretty good way to do it, but it requires quite a bit more setup, because I think one of the things that I'm concerned about is that we have a little bit of sort of open-endedness, right, in some areas. And I think it is probably a better and more gratifying way for us to break down the epics even a little bit further, and then ideally maybe arrive at sort of sub-epics that are very goal-oriented, as in, we are going to verify uploads, right? And that is the chunk of work, and it has very well-defined like issues, and that should be able to happen, let's say, within a month, right? Or like a month or two, but that's kind of it. And if we can chunk it down to that size, then we should think about it a little bit more. And I think that's something that I've been thinking about in the last few days, because I would like to avoid a situation where we sort of have issue creep in these epics. We look at things and we understand them better, and then while we understand them, we understand there are many more problems that we ought to fix, so we create more issues, we add them to the epics, and then they just expand indefinitely, right? And so I think my plan is in the next few days, slash like until the end of September, also to make sure that the epics that we have contain sort of smaller sub-epics that are like very, very clearly sort of, this is what we're going to do, and then maybe we can try to deliver that for a specific release, or at least we can be very strict in when we've done these 5 things, we're done with this epic and we're closing it, and if there's more stuff, right, we are going to open a new thing and say like, that's the next iteration, right? And I think that will allow us to close things off a little bit more easily. But it also means we have to do a little bit more like planning ahead of time, and that has worked out, I think, in some areas pretty well, so that we are pretty confident that we can enable certain things with the issues that exist, rather than having to like come up with like 15 other things along the way. But sometimes that's unavoidable. So that came to me. I just wanted to get it out.
Is there an example epic that we could use to sort of, sorry, I haven't been chatting much because I'm looking after Max and he's got his iPad really loud, so I've been typing my comments. But yeah, is there an example epic that we can look at sort of together to sort of show what you're thinking as far as like, you know?
Yeah, I have 2 actually. Let me share my screen quickly. Can you see this? Okay, so I think a good example is this one here. So like add unreplicated data types. I started with this, right? And I think in the beginning, also out of ignorance, I thought there are not that many data types left, right? But it turns out there is a really long list of items that actually still need to be replicated and aren't, right? Namely these here. So that's a large amount of work, right? Even like every individual piece here is a large amount of work, right? So I think stating on a high level that we want to replicate all unreplicated data types is still valid, right? That's the ultimate goal, but this is not something that is achievable in one iteration, right? And so when we started, and it's still a little bit messy, right? Let's say the support for design repositories was one single issue, right? It was not broken down further. It was, like one issue that had a weight of like, I think 5 or something like that, right? But when we actually like sat down with Douglas and we looked at what do we really need to do in order to look at design repositories, we ended up with, like 5 different issues with an average weight of like 3 or so. But this is a chunky amount of work, right? And I think if we did it, that would probably take us, let's say, a month to like go through that. And so I think something like this here, that is like we add the support for design repositories, and these are all the individual things that actually need to be done, and that links to add unreplicated data types. That makes sense to me, but I think that's kind of what we need to do for every single data type here. And then we can say, okay, we can talk about the priority independently and say like, well, design repositories are more important than Maven repositories, right? But actually we should do GitLab pages, and so we can have that discussion, but it becomes more concrete. Whereas this is a little bit like saying we're doing all the things, and all the things is a lot to do. And so I think I would like to have a structure more similar to this. And then we can also talk about more concretely the one single thing that we're going to enable. And I think that's maybe a pattern even for features, because I think in Geo, like I think the Docker replication is a good example, or the object storage support. They are individual features, but they still are a lot of work, and they can probably be broken down quite like easily into, or not easily, quite significantly into different things. So that is what I'm talking about. So that's one of the examples. The other one was for upload verification. So again, we have non-verified data sources, which is apparently difficult to do. And then when I think Mike sat down and actually talked about what needs to be done in order to actually, verify uploads, we end up with this, right? Which is already like very, very sizable, and will probably span at least, 3 releases to get there. So that's maybe even a little bit big, but there we are. But that again goes to like an effort on a like sort of thematic level, that we have the intention to verify all the data sources. I think in the beginning, I thought this was sort of epic issue level, but I don't think that's true. And I think so we need sort of this additional layer to account for that.
I have a more philosophical question. For this kind of epic that we expect it to grow in scope over time, like people are going to ship new things that needs to be replicated. How are you tracking this?
I think that's a good question, and I think philosophically speaking, I think I should probably add like verify all currently replicated data sets like at this point in time, because this is probably going to be a never-ending story. I think this was necessary, at least for me, to like write down why this is a problem worth solving, right, and why we should do it and why it's relevant. But I think there should be an understanding in general, right, like after this, that for a new data source, we will do this. And I think actually as part of the work that we're doing for replicating data, I think there's an understanding in Geo sort of growing that going forward for everything new, right, we always want to verify things as well, right? So it will become sort of a thing for new data types.
I think the key there is that we need to be involved. The Geo team need to be involved in the early discussions of a new type of data.
Yes.
Type that's added. So, whichever team that comes out of, and so yeah, I think it's the sort of cat and mouse style approach is to sort of pick it up after it's been implemented, which is kind of how we've been doing it. But yeah, I think the next iterative kind of improvement could be that we try and get more involved at the earlier stages of these new data types. And I think in parallel, it would be interesting for us to try and see, is there a way we can structure our code or put something in place that makes it really easy for new data types that are being created that automatically get Geo support. So yeah, instead of kind of retroactive, sort of making it work, we say, well, here's a framework we have for data types. If you stick to this interface, then it will just magically work with Geo. But I mean, that's easier said than done. But I think, there's definitely.
But I think But I think that again, I think is sort of a separate epic, right? Which is probably to say, make it easy or incredibly easy to support Geo when adding a new data type, right? And I think then we would need to look like, okay, what does that actually entail, right? And can we break that down further into sort of sub-epics, right? Because I'm a little bit out of my technical depth, because I can imagine that is sort of POC territory where we need to like explore like a couple of things, right? I think Douglas is doing this already to a certain extent. But I think that's a worthy goal in its own right.
Yeah, and a completely separate piece of work. There's undeniable value in having all the current data types we have being verified, and with the current method we have, and that definitely needs to be ticked off before we can even look to other ways of doing things. Just just thought I'd pop it in there while it was fresh in my mind.
No, I think that's absolutely valid and right, and something to think about. I think for me the point is more that like I personally think we're moving in the right direction with how we are like improving our process and how we're spending more time like planning out activities and trying to break them down. But I think the summary is that I think there is still like a little bit to go in order to arrive at a system that allows us to deliver individual chunks, right, and also get the satisfaction of like finishing something rather than having to deal with sort of scope creep, right? And I think that's kind of mostly what I want to say, and I think that's interesting in its own right, because I think many other folks, as far as I know, are not utilizing like epics in that way. There are other ways of doing it, but I think that that can be quite powerful. And frankly, I've enjoyed having also sort of engineering partners in a way to handle these issues on a more technical level, because I think my understanding is very limited on what is actually needed in order to achieve this, which is probably why I thought, for example, some things are easier than they actually are. But that's that. So
Ash, you're proposing we implement in the long run the active replication into GitLab or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I've thrown around some ideas. They're a bit left field, some of them, but the sort of Geo sits kind of to the side of the Rails app, and that we may get some benefit by putting it deeper into the stack. Like at the sort of model layer, or even at the connector or the adapter layer. So, something like that would possibly give us, and then there's the other extreme as well, completely extracting the service out into a separate, gem or something. But yeah, it's definitely something at a more fundamental layer. Is Fabian okay?
I think that might have been the doorbell.
Oh.
Yeah, there was a strange noise and then he ran. So either it was the doorbell or it was, it was a strange noise first. He didn't just run.
It was quick.
There you go. He's back.
If I'm choosing an athletics team, Fabian, I'll have you number one on my team.
Sorry, what?
You were very quick moving off out of your desk. I was impressed. And
I'm swift.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
It's primary quality, in a product manager. Swift movement away from, the problem and discussion.
Cool. Well, I'd very much like to talk further about the more longer term architectural things that we probably need to be taking a look at. But I am aware that we're at the half hour now. So I think I will put in some more time to have an actual video chat about some of the architectural things. I'll figure out how to do that across the time zones. Maybe we have the conversation twice in different forms. But I think it's good for us to be talking about those things now to try and figure out when is the right time to do this, when is the right time to make the changes, and then secondly, how we will actually go about doing that. So I'll put in some time where we can have some of those discussions and get started there. But I think we also need to just finish looking at the one that Douglas has proposed and see where that takes us. And I think that needs to start driving the conversation going forward. So I'll put in some time for that. Since it's the half hour, I want to wrap up now. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. And if anyone's able to join the call later, obviously, Ash, you might be a bit late for you. But looking forward to seeing everyone else if you can join the second call later on. So thanks very much for your time, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you, everyone.